For today's video, we're going to be discussing the topic of multi-system design, and why XCOM still remains to be one of the best of this form of game development, and why it's so hard to design and iterate on it. One of the more important design philosophy changes in the last decade was a sense of standardizing and kind of the blending of genres and systems. Now, if you don't know what the term is, a system in a video game is a collection of mechanics or verbs of what the player is going to be doing. So, if you're playing a first-person shooter, you're going to be making use of a shooting system. Platforming, jumping, and you get the picture. And over the last decade, this began a major push of combining genres and designs into their own unique thing. So one of the big examples, of course, is the implementation of RPG progression in first-person shooting, and how that led to the whole rise of Call of Duty, the continued success of Battlefield. You get the picture. But we could also talk about more action-based designs, such as the Soulsborne series, roguelites, and any other likes you can imagine, and so on and so forth. But the important point is that these games are built around being one system that may have unique elements from other genres or elements. Now, multi-system design is a different story, and this has been the basis for many of the XCOM style games. Of course, that's XCOM 2 up in the corner there, and it's kind of the antithesis of what we see. When we talk about games being multi-system, what that is that instead of being one essentially collective core gameplay loop, the game is basically split into several different systems that you're going to be interacting with. So besides XCOM, other examples would be the Total War franchise, Renowned Explorers, Godhood that we're going to be talking a little bit more about in a few minutes, and there are a few others that I am probably going to forget in this video. But the general concept is that you're not really playing one game. You're, in a sense, playing 2 or 3 smaller games that are all tied together into a single experience. And while that may sound confusing for somebody to understand what games would be considered multi-system, the easiest way to understand it is, does the game essentially have 2 or more completely different UIs that have to be used to play it? So when you play XCOM, or the original one, you have the tactical layer, you have the geoscape, and then you have base building. Oh, and another good example would be Star Control 2. I just remember that one off the top of my head. But the point is that instead of you focusing on one single gameplay, or one single gameplay loop, as in Mario, Doom, whatever, you're switching between them. So this would be if we have a racing game that also is a first-person shooter, which then turns into a tactical RPG dungeon-crawling horror game. You know, those kind of games out there. But, as I said at the start, XCOM is considered to be the de facto example of this kind of design. And from the outside, for someone who's not experienced, you may be wondering, why should you do this to yourself? Why should you design a game that's essentially 2 or 3 smaller games into one? And the reason is that while there is a lot of risks, this also opens up the door to creating a game that nobody else has ever seen before. And again, that's been one of the major reasons why XCOM has remained such a breakout franchise for many years now. Another point, it allows for more interesting elements of progression, or the progression loop of a game. In XCOM, you're going into the geoscape layer to hunt down aliens so that you can fight them in the tactical layer to get resources to take back to the base building layer that helps you back at the geoscape layer, and we just repeat the circle again and again and again. And when this works, especially with the Total War franchise, you basically create a niche onto yourself. And for a lot of these games that do make it to that level, they basically become the only game in town, or the only one delivering that specific style. But, as I'm sure you're probably about to ask, why don't we see more games? Why aren't there more XCOM style games or Total War games that are popular? And that's because multi-system design is notoriously difficult not only to implement, but to iterate and balance. And that is a more fascinating topic that we're going to be discussing and seeing if we can kind of crack the code on this in the back half of this video. But before we get there, the problem or the challenges of multi-system design are the very fact that you're not dealing with just one single core gameplay loop. The fact that you're split between 2 or 3 different systems, for one thing, it will double or triple the workload because you are designing separate UIs. You also need to balance them, and that is a nightmare in terms of traditional game development, because what you do in one system is going to affect the other ones, and vice versa. So if we go back to XCOM as an example for a second, let's say that we make the base building side harder. Maybe it requires more time for characters to recuperate, or the only way for characters to heal is you have to build a separate building inside of it. Sounds simple, right? But then what if, because you're having trouble keeping your units alive or keeping them healthy, it's going to affect what you can bring out to the tactical layer? And if you're not able to survive or be able to play well at that layer, how are you supposed to get the resources you need to do more of the geoscape or go back to the base building? And again, we can say this about any one of these systems. Renowned Explorers by Abbey Games also ran into this kind of challenge in terms of, while the tactical layer or the actual combat is very important, you also had to balance how skills and such worked at the map moving or kind of like that kind of roguelike layer. Not to mention the fact that if you run out of health or you run out of your resolve, the whole game ends. And like I said, developers who try to do this, they're aiming for that special, unique kind of design. Something that you're never going to see from anyone else. And again, it can work, but many times it just becomes a big struggle to balance. One of the other examples I could think of would be something like, I think it's the Curious Expedition. And I'm curious for people who played that, what you thought of that game. But with that said, it's time to switch to our second footage. So after this quick word to our Patreon supporters and sponsors, I want to talk more about Godhood. And the reason is that this is the first time that we have a multi-system game that we're able to track its development through early access and kind of see where these challenges and troubles come into play. And now a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom sponsors and Patreon supporters. Thank you so much. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, link down below. Alright, we're switching to footage of Godhood, and one thing that's very important to keep in mind is that the footage that you're seeing is based on the game after its first major content update while it's on early access, and what you see will most undoubtedly not represent the current version of the game, or even what may be available at the time you're watching this piece. But the reason why I brought this up, and was kind of the motivation for this video, is that Godhood is a multi-system game. You have the combat layer that you're seeing right here, and in about a minute you're going to see the kind of the city management slash follower management system. And the game itself, similar to Renowned Explorers, is built on these different systems interacting with each other, and the player having to understand how everything works. But with the game being in early access, it's giving us a very rare chance to see somebody design a multi-system game and where those decisions and paths may lead. If you look in the upper left hand corner of the screen right now, where you see the resources kind of being divvied up, that system was not in the first version of the game. And there's a very good chance that what you see may not even be in the next version of the game as well. And again, this is the beauty and nightmare of multi-system design. The very fact that when you change or alter one aspect, it affects the other parts of the game. And this is why it's so difficult to balance and iterate. Because you can't balance a game built on multiple systems or multiple gameplay loops by only affecting one of them. As another example, just imagine if for the designers when they're building a new Sid Meier's Civilization game, that they only look at one system at a time. Because as we all know, you only play Civilization either all military or all research, right? But that's the point here, and here's the example of what's going on with the game right now. In the original version of the game, you collected resources as many times as you had followers attached to a building, and you had a limit of 3 followers you can manage at any time or on each day. In the new version, you now, when you set or when you collect resources, it gets added to kind of a pot that you then will earn through combat or the sacraments. But the problem is that you're not really able to make use of them or make use of multiple people, because again, you only have 3 characters or 3 actions you can do a day, but many more buildings. Not only that, but it also limits how quickly you can level characters up and get them ready to be improved, thereby making these sacraments a little bit harder to manage as well. So again, you can see how changing one thing affects all the other systems attached to it. And like I said in the last part, just imagine any change in the original XCOM or Firaxis XCOM, and just picture in your head the ripples it sends out to the other systems. And with a game that's in early access, that's also being developed constantly and being iterated on, we're getting this chance to see how things go. As another example of a game that may not be multi-system, but again, you can see how much trouble there is. I could bring back up Clockwork Empires, and how developers sadly struggled with balancing these systems out, and then having those new elements affect what's already in the game. Over the course of its early access, they made massive changes to how the individual colonists behaved, how jobs worked, how resources were collected and spent, and you get the picture. And again, every time one of those systems were changed, it affected all the other systems of the game. And this can, if you're not careful as a developer, this can very much lead to that symptom of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. Especially if you make a change, and then you have to completely get rid of it because people weren't enjoying it. Because guess what? If you all those systems that you affected to try and make that one system work now have to be changed again. And as we all know, there's still only 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week to design these games. So that takes us to the big question for this video, and it's one that I don't think we're going to fully answer in however long this video is going to end up. What can you do to simplify designing a multi-system game? And this is a very tough question to answer. I'm going to also ask for any developers watching, if you want to share your thoughts on this, be sure to leave them in the comments. But I remember a conversation I had with Chris Park, again from Arkin Games, and we discussed The Last Federation. I think that's what was the name of the game. I may be confusing them. This was a 4X shmup, a turn-based strategy game where you play a character in the 4X universe who doesn't actually own any land or factions. He basically described it as you were Batman in a 4X game. And just an insane title to play, one that I could never really figure out how to play. But the point was that, again, we have a game that's built on multiple systems. And he discussed how he was trying to balance and fine-tune everything. And if I remember that conversation, I may have to link to that podcast in the description down below. But he talked about focusing on what was the main thing he wanted out of the game. What was that main feedback loop of The Last Federation that he wanted to have in it? And then he based all the decisions and all the other systems on that. If anything got in the way of the player experience that he wanted, it was going to be removed. If it was something that was too hard to figure out or was just not meshing, he would either change it or save it for an expansion as kind of a side or a standalone element that players want to opt in for, that they could. But at the end of the day, what he was telling me about was he got the core game experience. Again, the primary feedback loop down pat as quickly as possible. And once that was done, that was basically locked. Nothing could touch that element. And if something else wasn't working, he was going to remove it. Like, he would not try and fit a square peg into a round hole to make something work. Even if it was a cool system, if it was innovative, whatever, if it was just not meshing with that core experience, it wasn't worth changing it. Because again, if you change your core gameplay loop, you are changing every aspect of your game. And when we're talking about multi-system design, when we're actually changing different game systems, different UIs, that difficulty is compounded exponentially. Because as I was saying with the Clockwork Empire's example, if you cannot settle on the basic element of your game and you're making changes, then you are changing every part of your game. Because just as you saw with the Godhood example that's running on the screen now, when they changed how resource collection was handled, they also had to change the building progression. Now, they changed the building progression, guess what? They'll probably have to go back and change how resources are going to be handled, and how these systems affect how you work in combat, so combat may need to be fine-tuned as well. And I am going to be keeping a very close eye on Godhood over the course of its early access, because I really want to see how things are being charted in terms of balance and implementation of these systems. And I would advise anyone who's interested in building their own multi-system game to also do so as well. Because even what you're seeing right now in terms of progression, right now on the screen you're seeing the leveling system, that leveling curve was far more simple and reduced in the very first version of the game. So that could even be changed going forward as well. But to begin to wrap things up, XCOM's multi-system design, and of course by extension what we're going to be seeing most likely in Phoenix Point, are extreme examples of Masterclass game design. They're very hard to do right and very hard to balance, but when they work, you can get a game experience that nobody else will have on the market and will be very hard to replicate, as we have seen with the many XCOM-like clones and smaller games that unfortunately did not make anywhere near the same mark. But conversely, this kind of design is very hard to do right. Even with XCOM by Firaxis, I remember seeing talks that Jake Solomon gave about just how hard it was to try and make a new XCOM. And the very fact that you are designing essentially 2, 3, or more separate game systems, or just completely different games, and then tying them all together. And ultimately, the goal of multi-system design is to create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And if you can't get that to work, then you just do not have a successful game. But with that said, my final question for everyone watching: can you think of examples of multi-system design that did work, and why? And can you think of examples that just could not get that combination working? But thank you so much for watching today's video. Be sure to check out our Discord channel and all that linked down below, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great night. If you're looking for a book on design, my first title, 20 Essential Games to Study, is out now. It is available where most books are sold, and it comes in paper, hardcover, or digital copies. This is the perfect book for anyone interested in learning about game design, whether you are a student, enthusiast, or just a fan. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel linked down below, where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it. And tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.